Have you heard the saying, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns? I bet you've heard that before. But do you know where it actually comes from? No, it doesn't come from the NRA, or anything in the 20th century for that matter. You see, this bit of wisdom comes from an Italian criminologist who lived in the 18th century, that's the 1700s. Now, this thinker deeply influenced America's founders and drafters of the United States Constitution. He's a big reason, in fact, why we have a Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And he helps us see why gun regulations are not just useless, but actually counterproductive. So let's take a look at this thinker that you need to know, but you may never have heard of. His name, Cesare Beccaria. Hey folks, I'm Mark and welcome back to the Four Boxes Diner. Now you might be thinking, hey Mark, what does some long dead Italian scholar have to do with anything involving my Second Amendment rights? Well, actually, Cesare Beccaria has a lot to do with America's constitutional and legal system, including our Second Amendment rights. Beccaria was a prominent Italian thinker who's been called the father of modern criminology. He was a significant influence on America's founders. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, among others, were so taken by the work of Cesare Beccaria that they actually copied passages of his by hand in their own books. James Madison, the author of the U.S. Constitution, included Beccaria in his list of recommended reading for the Continental Congress. And the great British attorney, William Blackstone, who we've talked about before, he of course was a great influence on the founders, cited Beccaria more than any other source in his famous Blackstone commentaries. So it makes a lot of sense that the American legal community is starting to give Cesare Beccaria his due, as well they should. But courts and legal scholars are selective, in my view, in recognizing Beccaria's influence. And what do I mean by that? Well, as I've written about before in scholarly journals, judges have been happy to cite Beccaria's work when it comes to arguing against, for example, the death penalty. Now, legal scholars, you see, have traced the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments back to Beccaria's works. But you see, Beccaria was also important and received recognition for helping to shape the Fifth Amendment, right? The pardon power, criminal sentencing, and more, all things that touch on those criminal procedural rules that we find in the Bill of Rights to protect individuals against government overreach in the context of criminal charges and criminal cases. Okay, but there's a glaring omission, at least up until recently, in my view, when it comes to the revival of the scholar of Cesare Beccaria. And what exactly is that omission? The glaring omission, in my opinion, is how Cesare Beccaria inspired the founding fathers of the United States to protect the right to keep and bear arms in the Second Amendment itself. You see, progressive judges, liberal judges, and scholars like to cite to Beccaria sort of to put an originalist spin, kind of like an originalist as to how to understand the Constitution, an originalist spin on anti-death penalty arguments. That's classically how Beccaria has been used by liberals. But you see, they're mum about something else. They basically ignore, not always, but they downplay, at least, in my view, how Cesare Beccaria talked about the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. And why is that? Well, look, the reality is that's a part of the Bill of Rights that a lot of liberals, progressives, simply don't like. They don't want you and they don't want me to be able to protect ourselves with firearms. So they downplay a critical scholar who they otherwise like to use, a man named Cesare Beccaria. But sorry, you see, you can't flush Cesare Beccaria down the memory hole when it suits you. This is especially true with the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court has said that you cannot determine the scope of the right to keep and bear arms without looking at the historical evidence of what it meant when the Second Amendment was framed and approved and ratified by Americans in the 18th century. And of course, if you look at the history of the Second Amendment and the entire Constitution, you'll see that Italian Enlightenment scholar Cesare Beccaria was a critical key part of that historical intellectual background. Now, why is this? It's because Cesare Beccaria saw self-defense individual self-defense as a natural right, and he fiercely opposed gun control. Take this passage that none other than Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, liked so much that Jefferson himself copied it into his legal commonplace book. You see, Beccaria wrote that gun bans disarm only those, quote, who are not disposed to commit the crime which the laws meant to prevent. In other words, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Beccaria added that restrictive gun laws do not prevent violent crime. And why is that? It's because, Beccaria explained, quote, it requires less courage to attack unarmed people versus armed persons. Cesar Beccaria said that in the 18th century. So you see, to Cesar Beccaria, it made no sense to ban guns out of fear that they would be misused. He said they would be like depriving people of fire for fear of being burnt, or of water for fear of being drowned. Again, bear in mind, this is in the 18th century. At the time the Constitution was being written, this is not so-called 20th or 21st gun rights propaganda, which the anti-gunners like to claim. No, this is serious scholarship written by the Italian Enlightenment scholar Cesar Beccaria at the time of our founding. So you see, Cesar Beccaria in the 18th century anticipated what became the modern argument by the anti-gunners, that we should give up our gun rights in the name of public safety, because if you get rid of the guns, everyone will be safer, which of course we know is simply not true. And luckily for us in America, Cesar Beccaria's arguments were inspiring to the founders of the Constitution, which is why they wrote the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms and enshrined it not just for 18th century Americans, but for 21st century Americans like ourselves. Beccaria thought that the government's essential function was to prevent crime and disorder. So he would have been appalled that we have such restrictive gun policies today in many parts of the United States. This is especially true that in many of those places, the state seems unwilling or unable to preserve order. Think of the loud cries to defund the police in 2020, or think of the mayors and the governors who've done nothing as rioters tore through their communities and tore much of their communities to pieces. Or do you remember in 2020, the St. Louis couple Mark and Patricia McCloskey, during the George Floyd protest, they stood outside their home with firearms to deter protesters from damaging property or even harming them. They never even fired a shot, but they still had to plead guilty to misdemeanors and pay fines because of the local district attorney. Now, the governor of Missouri later pardoned them, but that was only after a year of court cases, legal fees, and media outrage. Now, couldn't you imagine Cesar Beccaria, the author of On Crimes and Punishment, being on board with any of this? Absolutely not. Do you need further proof that Beccaria's concerns about disarming ordinary people would have a negative effect on society? Any further proof that this conclusion was correct? Well, if you look at the anti-gunners, again, if you look at what the anti-gunners are saying, that the safest places in America should be those places with the most restrictive gun laws, places like New York City, Chicago, or Los Angeles. The high crime rates in those places make clear, of course, that anti-gun laws don't work. Cesar Beccaria's view that disarming ordinary people actually punishes the ordinary people, it was absolutely correct. Those liberal bastards I just mentioned disarm law-abiding citizens by and large, while criminals get to roam free with guns, terrorizing the law-abiding and the innocent. So now you know why Cesar Beccaria is an important part of the Second Amendment story in the United States. The Supreme Court tells us that we need to understand the history of the Second Amendment in order to interpret it properly and protect our rights fully. And Cesar Beccaria is a crucial part of this history. More courts need to acknowledge him. And Beccaria is not a mere historical footnote, mind you. His arguments are more relevant today than ever before. The anti-gunners are doing whatever they can to restrict your gun rights and my gun rights. Meanwhile, government is unable to preserve order in many parts of the United States, and Cesar Beccaria's writings from the 18th century shows just why this is such a dangerous combination of making it hard for law-abiding Americans to have firearms while at the same time encouraging criminals to go out there and do bad things to good people. So again, thanks again for joining me here at the Four Boxes Diner, where we serve hot, fresh Second Amendment news and analysis. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe and spread the word. We really would appreciate it. And again, we'll see you next time soon at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.